Good morning, everyone. I am Chok Wong, and today my groupmates and I will be going through this poster on domestic violence against women in Malaysia. We'll be exploring the present state of the law, the support mechanisms available for victims, the challenges in law, and also our recommendations to remedy these challenges. Domestic violence has been described by some academics to be an epidemic spreading through Malaysia. And even though the judiciary and the legislature has shown efforts in amending the laws to allow it to keep up with the times, statistics has shown that domestic violence against women has been on the rise, as seen through a research done by the Women's Aid Organization. The research showed that the number of reported cases of domestic violence in 2010 was 3,173, while the number of reported cases in 2018 increased to a staggering 5,421 cases. The main governing laws of domestic violence is the Domestic Violence Act of 1994, and it provides for the definition of domestic violence. However, it is important to note that the definition is not static in nature, but in fact changes and adapts according to the needs of the time. The original definition of domestic violence, as provided by Section 2 of the DVA, was rather limited in nature, as it only provided for physical and sexual abuse. However, this definition received much criticism, as it often did not reflect the reality of domestic violence, as the victims often receive psychological abuse as well. Therefore, the Act was once again amended to include multiple forms of psychological and emotional abuse, thus expanding the scope of domestic violence. The definition was once again expanded to provide for a more comprehensive view, and Section 2 has now been amended to include multiple forms of abuse to the victim's property or financial abuse. This means that the definition of domestic violence now includes physical, psychological, financial, and sexual abuse, with a comprehensive list of harm included in Section 2 of the DVA. The DVA is also very clear with who can be a victim of domestic violence, with all members of a family being applicable, including former spouses, as seen in the case of Manggalaswari Ponampalam, where the court held that a person can still commit an act of domestic violence against his or her former spouse, even after a divorce. Aside from this, the DVA also provides for multiple forms of relief for the victims. The first of such relief is a protection order. Under the DVA, 3 types of protection order can be applied for: a protection order, an interim protection order, and an emergency protection order. A protection order can be applied after the victim is informed by a police officer that a criminal proceeding will be instituted against the abuser, or it can be applied at any time during the criminal proceedings. The order will be effective for a time period of 12 months or less, but it can be extended for another 12 months if so required. Furthermore, it is generally deemed as the most effective, as the court can include additional orders if necessary. An interim protection order, on the other hand, is issued by the court during the pendency of the investigations of the abuser to offer victims a more temporary protection. Finally, an emergency protection order can be issued by a welfare officer without lodging a police report, but it is only issued under emergency circumstances when the victim is in urgent need of protection. Once applied, the protection order must be issued within 2 hours, and it will be effective for 7 days from the date of issuance. Since this order is only available for emergency circumstances, it is limited to cases involving paragraph A and B of Section 2 of the DVA. Aside from these, the DVA also provides for right for compensation to the victims who suffered injury and financial loss as a result of domestic violence. Furthermore, additional compensation can be made through the Criminal Procedure Code upon application by the public prosecutor. Therefore, the victim could choose to apply for compensation through a civil action and also through a criminal action. Aside from the DVA itself, the Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act of 1976 also provides for multiple forms of protection, such as providing for an injunction against molestation, as well as the right to apply for divorce based on the breakdown of marriage due to the unreasonable behavior of the husband. However, one glaring flaw of the protection provided by the LRA is that all the protection would only begin following the inception of a matrimonial proceeding. This can clearly be seen in the case of Cheng Gai Kyu and Ang Tek Bu, where the court held that since there was no pendency of any matrimonial proceeding, the application for an injunction order was dismissed. Another statute is the Islamic Family Law Federal Territories Act of 1984, which provides similar protection as the LRA but applies to Muslim instead, and the same limitation also applies to this act. I'll now pass it on to Landy to expand on the support mechanisms for victims of domestic violence. Thank you.
Thanks, Job. Hi, I'm Landy Lua. I will present on the support mechanism for victims of domestic violence. In Malaysia, there are some support mechanisms which provide supports and assistance to the victims who are facing domestic violence, especially women. The first support mechanism for victims of domestic violence is through non-governmental or non-profit organizations, such as Women's Aid Organization, WOW, or Women's Action Society, AWAM, and Women's Centers for Change, WCC. All these organizations are all aiming to protect women's rights and providing supports and services to women who are the survivors of domestic violence. Firstly, WOW, with its visions and missions of eradicating violence against women and advance gender equality, has offered many services to women victims of domestic violence. These services are complementary, which including counseling, providing shelter for women in immediate danger, a 24-hour helpline, legal representations, and other services. For example, WOW educates over 3,000 women annually about their rights through hotline, SMS or WhatsApp, which is TINA, as well as giving shelter to more than 100 women every year, ensuring that women fleeing violent homes have somewhere to go. To enhance the domestic violence Act 1994, WOW also collaborated with the Ministry of Women, Family and Community Development. Besides, we also have AWAM, which its visions and mission is to have a just, democratic and equitable society which everyone is treated with respect and is free from all kinds of discriminations and violence, especially towards women. Other than provide a gender-based support services, they also implement policy advocacy. They advocate for a legislation to be passed, change or repeal that will eradicate gender-based violence and enhance the rights of women. Next, WCC is committed to put an end to violence against women, empower them, and advance social justice and gender equality. They offer support to women victims by providing free, confidential services to women who are experiencing domestic violence, such as counseling service in multiple language, temporary shelters, and legal information. The social worker from WCC, if necessary, will accompany the women's victims to the social welfare office, hospital, and police stations. WCC also offers assistance in court if the victim's case proceeds to trial. The victims will have a social worker and advocacy officer with her throughout the court procedures in order to support her, follow up with the police and other agencies, set up pre-trial briefings, and etc. Other than those non-governmental organizations, Malaysia's Social Welfare Department, Jabatan Kebajikan Masyarakat will also offer assistance to victims of domestic violence when they lodge a complaint in the department. JKM will provide counseling, financial support, and most importantly, they will encourage the victims to seek medical attention from the One-Stop Crisis Center or SCC in government hospitals if needed. All pertinent agencies will respond when they contacted to provide assistance at the OSCC, which is a Patient Center Management Center, which will also assess victims' injuries or hurt, both mentally and physically, in order to provide support and to aid the police investigations as well as to treat the victim's injury accordingly. The second support mechanism for victims of domestic violence is through legal aids. This is because victims of domestic violence may require legal support to defend themselves and their families. For example, the Malaysian Bar Council has a legal aid that offers legal assistance to the victims of domestic violence, including advice on restraining orders, divorce, and custody. Furthermore, legal aids department also help with both civil and criminal cases. Besides, we also have Legal Advisory and Women's Aid Center LAWA, which established by Wanda MCA in 2014 to fight for justice, protect women's rights, stand up for women victims of all races, particularly those who are suffering because of domestic violence. One of the main focuses of LAWA is on domestic violence matter, and it will give all female victims, regardless of their ethnicity, religions, background, with a free legal advice, counseling, and assistance. In the meantime, LAWA will offer the best legal services by providing lawyers who are knowledgeable about women's issues for cases involving domestic violence. LAWA thus far has received more than 600 requests for assistance from victims who are suffering from sexual harassment and domestic violence. Recently, there is a campaign named Are You OK?, which provides legal aids to victims of domestic violence, particularly for the women in the B40 groups of Malaysia. The third support mechanism is police. Domestic violence victims can submit their cases to the police. This is because police has an obligation to conduct investigation and takes appropriate steps to safeguard the victims from more harm. For example, an enforcement officer is defined as a police officer or a social welfare officer in Section 2 of the Domestic Violence Act 1994. Thus, in accordance with Section 19, Subsection 1 of the Domestic Violence Act 1994, police officer has a duty to help the victims of domestic violence apply for an interim protection order pertaining to the domestic violence, provide transportation for the victims to a safer place and the closest hospital if the treatment is needed. Besides, they also needs to explain to the victims the rights to protections against the domestic violence and accompany the victims to her residence to collect the personal belongings. Moreover, in pursuance of Section 19, Subsection 2, Subsection A of the Domestic Violence Act 1994, the police officer also has additional responsibilities such as using the arrest authority granted by this Act or any other written law. Therefore, when a woman was abused domestically, she can obtain support and help from the police by lodging a report at the nearest police station. Since all the domestic violence cases are to be seizable offence under Section 18A of the Domestic Violence Act 1994, hence upon receiving a report of domestic violence, police can launch an investigation right away. Besides, the victim also can obtain a referral letter from police that the victim's case is now under the police investigation. Therefore, the victims can bring the letter to JKM for applying interim protection order based on Section 5 of Domestic Violence Act 1994. That's all for me about the support mechanism for women victims of domestic violence. Thank you very much.
You might wonder, since there's law in place and support mechanisms, but why does domestic violence still happen? Domestic violence is a complex issue with its challenges, and these challenges can be divided into three categories, namely the deficiencies in law, the weaknesses in the support mechanism, and the barriers faced by the victims. Firstly, I'll be explaining the deficiencies in the law. Just like every other law, the law on domestic violence has its flaws. Despite the various protections offered in the DVA, it should be noted that domestic violence is not a specific crime in Malaysia. As have been mentioned, DVA is to be read together with the relevant offences under the Penal Code, meaning if a victim wishes to press charges against their abuser for their violence, they could rely on relevant sections in the Penal Code. Hence, there is no guarantee that the abuser will be punished for their violence, as it is subjected to whether the victim can prove beyond reasonable doubts that the abuser has caused hurt and grievous hurt. This might discourage victims from reporting domestic abuse cases because they do not want to go through the long court process just for the abuser to walk free of punishments. The next deficiency in law is with regards to the compensation. It is observed that application for compensation under Section 10 of the DVA is normally made in conjunction with an application for dissolution of marriage. This means that it is likely that the compensation scheme under DVA will not be available for Muslim women, as seen in the case of Muhammad Habibullah Mahmud and Farida. Unfortunately, Muslim victims could not claim for compensation under DVA in circumstances where they have applied for dissolution of marriage, even if there is no provision under Islamic Family Law Act that allow victims to claim for compensation, as the Federal Court held in the case of Majlis Ugama Islam Pulau Pinang dan Seberang Perai and Syed Zulkifli Syed Nata. While some may point out that an application for compensation under Section 10 can be made as a standalone application without the dissolution of marriage, thus keeping the case in the sole jurisdiction which is the civil jurisdiction. However, the fallacy of this logic is that women likely would not apply for compensation while staying in a marriage in which they suffer violence. This is because if they were to do so, they would most likely face further violence from the partner as a revenge for exposing the abuser. With that being said, it is likely Muslim women will not be able to rely on the compensation scheme under the DVA. Moving on to the deficiency in compensation under Section 426 Sub 1A of the Criminal Procedure Code. Although victims of domestic violence can also claim for a compensation under the section, provided that their abuser is found guilty of crime under the Penal Code, it should be noted that this is subjected to application made by the public prosecutor. Thus, where a public prosecutor priority is to penalize the abuser for their crime and not compensation for the victim would miss out on the opportunity to be compensated that they deserve. Moreover, the section is silent on the legal consequence of non-compliance of the compensation order, making it difficult to enforce such an order. Aside from this, there is also an issue of inadequate compensation because the measure for the amount of compensation to be granted under both DVA and CPC depends on the abuser's ability to pay. Thus, it is not guaranteed that the victim would receive sufficient compensation for their loss. This is an issue considering how studies have shown that one of the major factors contributing to domestic violence is financial problems in the household. Moving on to the second category of challenges in respect to domestic violence, and that is the weakness in support mechanisms. One of the criticisms of support mechanisms is that victims feel that there is a lack of clear and direct guidance on how to proceed when they reach out to support mechanisms for help. This worsens the issues of victims feeling frustrated by the lengthy process of seeking justice, deterring them from reporting domestic violence because they do not want to go through an emotionally tiring and time-consuming process. Another setback of support mechanisms, even the successful ones such as the One-Stop Crisis Center, is that it is not available in some rural areas because the reach of such support mechanisms is limited by the lack of resources since there is a lack of state funding. This is further worsened by the fact that there is an over-reliance on the NGOs to provide services to the victims.
There are various barriers faced by women in their journeys in seeking for justice in the domestic violence situations. But let's talk about the first and arguably the biggest barrier faced by women in the domestic violence situations. That is the public opinion/public attitude on domestic violence. This is influenced by the cultural values, the patriarchal values, and the religious values. The overall public opinion on domestic violence is filled with social stigmas, and the general attitude seems to be that domestic violence is a private family matter that is not to be interfered by third parties and outsiders, and it is often paired with the saying of, "Do not air out your dirty laundry." This is especially so in light of the fact that domestic violence is not a specified crime in our penal code, which means that it is not treated as the serious crime that it is. This unfortunately contributed to women being dismissive of the pain and suffering in the domestic violence situations, because they are under that mistaken belief and cultural teaching that domestic violence is a family matter and they should not be publicizing it. Aside from the cultural values, the public opinion is also influenced by patriarchal values, under which many women are taught that their duty as a wife is to maintain a home and to protect their husband's honor. This resulted in reluctance in reporting domestic violence cases because women fear that instead of getting the help that they need when they report a case, they would be getting the blame for failing to fulfill their duty to maintain a home and for violating their husband's honor by disclosing the violence that they experience in a home. Muslim women in particular are further affected by religious values on top of the cultural values and patriarchal values that we just discussed. This is not to say that their religion caused them pain and suffering in any way, but that religious teachings and values are often misused against these women to justify the violence done to them. The Quran teaches Muslim women that a woman's heaven is beneath her husband's feet, which oftentimes can be misunderstood and misinterpreted as saying a woman should not disobey her husband in any circumstances at all. And as a result, Muslim women fear disclosing violence because they think that it would be equivalent as disobeying their husband. And if they were to disobey their husband, they would face nushuz allegation as a consequence. The term nushuz means failure to obey a husband's wishes and commands. However, this is all but a misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the Quran. Because just as Quran teaches women to obey their husband, it also forbids violence against wives. All those social stigmas surrounding domestic violence does not only make a woman hesitant in reaching out for help, but it is also causing poor response from authorities who handle domestic violence cases. Because these cultural values, patriarchal values, and religious values affect not only a woman's thinking, but the societies at large. Some studies have shown that from the interviews with authorities, some officer thinks that it is a woman's fault for their experience of domestic violence at home. And some victims have also come forth with stories that public authorities have refused to take their statement, claiming that it is a private marital affair not to be interfered by police. Aside from that, local studies have also revealed that despite the existence of a written protocols on domestic violence management in a healthcare setting, 30% of doctors have never inquired their patients about possible domestic violence in their home. This could be partly due to doctors being unaware of such protocols, and partly due to doctors thinking that it is rude to inquire someone about their family matters. The consequences of all of this is inefficiency and professional incompetence in the handling of domestic violence cases, but also deterring victims from reaching out for help as they lose faith in a system that is ignorant and dismissive of their pain and suffering. Although there has been an improvement on protection and support by police officers in recent years due to the establishment of a special police unit called the Sexual Women and Children's Investigation Division, which specialize in handling cases involving female victims and have the necessary skills to do so, there is still the issue of limited trained staff in the division. Another barrier faced by many women in a violent home is the financial dependency on the abuser. As studies have shown, many women who suffer from domestic violence are housewives who are unable to support for themselves financially. This means that they often kept quiet about the abuse that they face at home in fear that they will struggle financially if they were to report their husband. This is especially so in cases where the victims have children with the abuser, for they often worry that if they were to report the abuser for their violent behavior, they would be financially unable to provide for their children and as a result have the custody taken away from them. In addition, there is a lack of awareness as to the relevant remedies and resources that are available to the victims. They lack information on the relevant law and support mechanisms which they could rely on, as studies have shown that only 8% of women is aware of the existence of the Domestic Violence Act 1994. On top of the lack of awareness, an interview also revealed that some victims feel that the process to legal remedy is bureaucratic and that they find it confusing because there is no direct and clear guideline as to what to do. And as a result, they often choose not to reach out for help because they do not wish to go through such an exhausting process. It has also been pointed out that the current court system is unsuitable to deal with domestic violence cases, considering the nuances that surrounds domestic violence which the system lacks an understanding for. A court system that lacks understanding on the barriers faced by victims will only make them reluctant to rely on such court and further intimidate them from reaching out for help.
Hi everyone, my name is Tan Sheng and I'll be presenting on the recommendations to remedy the challenges discussed before. To remedy the deficiency in law, domestic violence should be made a specific punishable crime. Various academics has recommended that domestic violence should be addressed as a specific punishable crime instead of invoking the available offences in the penal code in order to reflect the serious nature of domestic violence and to guarantee that those who commit domestic violence does not walk away without punishment, thus encouraging women to report the domestic violence that they face. This is because if domestic violence is criminalized, it might deter people from abusing their wife because now it becomes clear that doing so would mean committing a crime which could have more serious repercussions. Moreover, it can be argued that criminalizing domestic violence could help to remedy the issue of public attitudes towards domestic violence. Because when the state shows their commitment by criminalizing domestic violence, it sends a message to the public that domestic violence is not to be treated as a mere familiar matter. For people to take domestic violence seriously, the state has to take it seriously. One might argue that criminalizing domestic violence will worsen the situation as women are already reluctant to report their abuser due to the barriers that they face, which has been discussed above. Which is why this recommendation should work in hand with the support mechanism to provide financial aid, training for women to be self-sufficient, raising awareness about domestic violence to do away with social stigma. Besides, a specialized court for domestic violence should be established. It is proposed that Malaysia should set up a special court so that domestic violence could be more effectively dealt with. In Singapore, a sophisticated infrastructure to facilitate the approach of domestic violence has been developed, as well as establishment of a family court. Therefore, it is also wise that the Malaysian government could introduce a specialized court which deals with domestic violence cases specifically. To remedy the issue of compensation, legislation could amend Section 426 Clause 1A to allow victims to make an application for compensation instead of the public prosecutor, and to clarify on the legal consequences of non-payment of compensation. It is also suggested that the government should establish a state-funded compensation scheme like the other countries such as United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, United States, Canada, and Australia. The state-funded compensation could offer financial aid for victims without them having to apply to the courts. This could apply to both Muslim and non-Muslim victims, since there won't be conflicting jurisdiction of the courts, and also potentially solve the issue of inadequate compensation because the measure of compensation will not be limited by the abuser's ability to pay. To remedy the issue of social stigma and misuse of religious values, awareness should be raised among the public. Educating people on the seriousness of domestic violence to dismantle the social stigma and do away the clause of harmful cultural beliefs on people's mind. This is so that the victim will not be held back by harm thinking that stops them from reaching out for help, but also to help authorities to become more equipped with knowledge and understanding on domestic violence so that they can assist victims in a more professional and effective way. Informative program can educate people concerning issues relating to miscomprehensions of religious principles so that Muslim women will be able to exercise their rights according to Islamic tenets. In shining light on knowledge regarding domestic violence, it could help women to be more aware of resources that they could rely on, hence encouraging them to reach out for help. In addition, it could also educate the public in noticing signs of abuse which could assist in disclosure of abuse. In shining light on knowledge regarding domestic violence, it could help women to be more aware of the resources that they could rely on, hence encouraging them to reach out for help. In addition, it could also educate the public in noticing signs of abuse which could assist in disclosure of abuse. It could be argued that education and awareness is the key element in combating domestic violence. Because even if the law is reformed to be as perfect as possible, if there's no change of knowledge and attitude at large, it will just be a bird without wings, because the law will only bring forth justice when they are assessed by those who need it. To remedy financial dependency, it has been suggested that a multidisciplinary team should be established to assist women in gaining financial independence. Workshops and training courses could be offered to equip women with skills that will help them financially support themselves in long term. This will not only encourage more victims to escape their abusive household by doing away with financial constraint, but it will also make them less susceptible to abuse in the future because financial independence will give them some degree of personal control over their own life. Last but not least, to remedy the shortcoming of support mechanism, some propose that to make the process less complicated and less overwhelming for victims, various types of resources, whether it is NGO or public service, should develop standard written protocols with regards to the procedures in victims' help-seeking process. This can avoid wasting resources due to the overlap areas that are involved in providing support services for victims, and also facilitate an effective collaboration among supportive networks to offer an overall easier and reliable procedural pathways for victims. It is also proposed that workers or volunteers in support mechanism should receive training to equip them with better knowledge on how to handle domestic violence case, and also to equip them with effective communication skills. Besides, Special Police Unit D11 should be expanded to improve services provided for victims of domestic violence. However, to achieve the above recommendations, the government should provide sufficient funds and resources for the various support mechanisms. That's all from me. Thank you.